Election 2020, the debate debacle, the Supreme Court battle, and the potential for chaos after November 3rd. Cheddar's JD Durkin joins us for a special politics podcast. Here's what you need to know. Well, it's early October, which means we're just about 1 month until Election Day. I am Jill Wagner, here as always with Carlo Versano. Hey, Carlo.
Jill, good morning.
Good morning. And joining us is Cheddar's White House correspondent, JD Durkin. JD, love having you on. Thank you so much for coming on today.
It's been way too long,
It's great to be with you, Jill and Carlo. Good morning, my friends.
So let's get right into it, JD. The last time that we had you on, in what feels like a different world pre-COVID, you had predicted that perhaps President Trump would win re-election. Does that still hold?
Putting you on the spot there.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I've been saying that I think this is the ultimate jump ball election. And I think if you hold the election 10 times, Joe Biden wins 5 of them and President Trump wins 5 of them. And so because I previously predicted in a pre-COVID era that Donald Trump would win, I think I will stick with that prediction. I know a lot of polling out there from 538 says Joe Biden is favored to win 75% or so out of every 100 chances or so. But it's tough to match enthusiasm. And I think that despite all of the unknown factors out there with regards to the historic surge in mail-in voting, a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, and trying to pull off an election during it, I do think at the end of the day, right now, because I previously predicted it and I want to stick with my prediction, I do think we could easily have an outcome where President Trump pulls in the necessary votes in the necessary states. It's all a numbers game.
Wow. And to that end, JD, you have visited these so-called pivot counties, which will likely decide the election. Can you explain for us what exactly is a pivot county, and what are voters on the ground telling you?
Sure. So there are 206 pivot counties. And for perspective, there's a little more than 3,000 counties or so in the country. And a pivot county is a place that voted twice for Barack Obama and then pivoted in 2016 to vote for Donald Trump. And the 206 pivot counties turned this electorate red in historic fashion back in 2016, the likes of which pollsters really did not anticipate. And so as part of our series, we visited a handful of these communities to really do kind of community local profiles, try and get a sense of the flavor, what makes these Americans wake up in the morning, what makes them tick, and what is it about either about Secretary Clinton they did not like in 2016, or what was it that really drew them to President Trump a few years ago. And I think there had been a lot of enthusiasm pre-pandemic in a lot of these communities to stick with what a lot of these people thought was working. In other words, they were big Donald Trump fans throughout most of our series that we were producing there on the ground. That tone and tenor did change a little bit with the outcome of the pandemic. Heard from a lot of pivot voters that they were frustrated with how this White House handled this once-in-a-lifetime challenge, and they really thought that President Trump misstepped frequently. But I do have to say our last 2 episodes were Monroe County, Florida, which is the Florida Keys, and Northampton County, Pennsylvania, which is sort of the Bethlehem, Easton area. And I have never visited parts of the country, Jill and Carlo, where more Trump flags passionately fly. And I think as we get closer to the election, people who are Donald Trump supporters are out loud about it. They are passionate about it. And I think that speaks a lot of the enthusiasm that we have seen in historic fashion built up around this White House. This is much more than politics. This is almost a team sport at this point. And you visit a lot of these communities in places like Pennsylvania, and right next to their Eagles and Steelers flags, they are flying Trump-Pence flags. And I think that's a lot of what you get in these pivot counties right now.
JD, I'm glad you said that, because you keep hearing in the media and from pollsters this idea of like the shy Trump voter, the people that, especially in 2016, who, maybe they didn't want to tell a pollster on the phone that they were supporting Trump, but they broke for him late. It doesn't seem. How do you square the so-called shy Trump voter with what you just said, which are people who are out there? They seem pretty enthused about him.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's been a lot of postmortems done back in 2016 about to what degree the so-called shy Trump voter definitely exists. I've definitely visited these pivot communities. I remember speaking with a few individuals out in Valencia County, New Mexico, which is a bit south of Albuquerque, was one of the pivot of counties that we went to. And I remember meeting with voters who said, I actually don't really want to tell people in my family or my bosses, my employee, I don't necessarily want people to know that when I go into the voting booth, I vote for Donald Trump. But I think there's been a lot of polling prognosticators that say, well, maybe it's not so much they were actually shy Trump voters out there who didn't want to tell pollsters how they felt, much more that maybe the sampling or the weighting kind of wasn't done correctly. For instance, maybe there wasn't enough weight or emphasis put on white, non-college educated voters and different demographics like that broke for President Trump. I think you have a lot of individuals at this point, Carlo and Jill, who have just felt so emboldened to say, we love Donald Trump. We are so excited to hang these flags. We see images on social media about the boaters for Trump, right? The boating community that comes out in waves, no pun intended. Yep. Yeah, of course. And they are definitely passionate, but I think every once in a while, yeah, and my reporting on the ground would suggest this. You do have some people who say, hey, listen, I don't like the tweets. I don't like the this. They're definitely not going to be fans of the debate performance we saw the other night, but they're sitting there pointing to a few key points of personal electoral calculus, and they're saying, yeah, I think I will vote for this guy again.
Okay, I want to get to the debate in a minute, but you mentioned just some of the issues here. What are the issues that are resonating? Because I think there are issues that the media talks about, right? There's the tax returns. Remember, it wasn't that long ago, there was an impeachment in February. I think that was. It feels like that was a different lifetime.
The Woodward book?
What did you say, Carlo?
No, like the Woodward book, that was the big story.
Right.
The stuff in the Atlantic the week before about him allegedly calling soldiers losers. I don't mean to step on you, Jill, but I think what you're saying is right, which is, there's these sort of stories that get big play in the media and then they sort of die off. Do those actually, do those resonate? I think, right?
I'm only laughing because it's like in any other, if you just took that sentence and said it 10 years ago or wherever else, you'd be like, right. What are you, like, are you drunk? What is going on? But
right.
JD, no, for real, what do people actually care about? What are the issues that resonate with them?
Yeah, there's a ton of noise, and you got to separate what I call the interests of blue checkmark Twitter or the Acela corridor crowd, which, to be honest, is comprised of the vast majority of mainstream or national news outlets that tend to be based either in Washington, D.C. or in New York City, and separate a lot of kind of the noise and headlines, and rightfully so. The storylines that Carlo just broke out are of intense national importance, but they are given outsized weight in terms of conversation by people in the so-called Acela corridor. Yeah, they may reach Americans in places like Berlin, New Mexico, or Colfax, Iowa, or Mankato, Minnesota, where we've gone for the pivot counties. But, they impact people and they kind of very quickly forget about them. At the end of the day, I still think the economy and healthcare, and I think that's the Democrats' biggest message heading into this election. Healthcare is the reason that they won back the gavel to control the House of Representatives, which allowed them to impeach the president last year. And it's because they had a cohesive message on healthcare. And so I think those kind of so-called kitchen table issues, that hasn't fundamentally changed. I don't think the interests, the basic needs of American families are different in 2020 than they were 20, 30, or 40 years ago. You're still going to vote on those issues. It's just that there's a lot more noise, many more shiny, sparkly things to distract every voter's attention, because that's just the way that I think headlines, social media, the 24-hour news cycle allows for those shiny thing stories. Again, the issues Carlo brings up, the accounts in the Bob Woodward book, the Atlantic reporting, these are incredibly important stories that I think might doom any other White House. But here in 2020, it's just like an average Tuesday that there's going to be another huge scandal. I just think there's so much exhaustion from so many Americans out there about scandal after scandal that they sort of roll right off the back at this point.
See, I do agree with you there, JD, but I have a okay, I should say that I have this hunch, but it's based on literally nothing other than my own brain.
Go.
Yes, which is that the tax return story is different. because I've always believed that this issue of sort of fairness, right? This, is something that is just really viscerally felt, right? And so when you have a number like $750 that the president paid in federal income tax for the first 2 years of his presidency, to me that breaks through, because anybody, even if you're not paying attention to the election, you see that and you say, Donald Trump's a billionaire. Why is he paying less in taxes than I am? That's crazy. Now, again, I say that without knowing anything, if that's true or not, but it's just sort of like this gut sense to me.
I agree with you. I've spoken with 2 pivot voters since that story broke, and I will say neither of them brought it up, for whatever that's worth. Very anecdotal. One in New Jersey and one in Pennsylvania. And again, I think there's so much else to focus on. I agree. The part of the New York Times story that's fascinating is there is a beltway component to it that we all here in Washington talk about incessantly. And then there's an average American component. And I think Carlo just drilled out of the park that second component, which is the average American family, no matter where you are. You look at that headline, and first of all, though, Carlo, you need to believe it. And I promise you, there's probably about 40% of the country that's going to look at this story and say, ain't happening, news, not true, total fake news, failing New York Times, give back the Pulitzers, right? Because that's the language that they've brought in. So, A, you need to believe the reporting is true. But if you do, then I agree with you. That's the troubling component. The Beltway thing that I think worries most people here at like your average Washington, D.C. happy hour is the national security component. And I think this was a big missed opportunity for Chris Wallace on the debate stage to say, Mr. President, who do you owe all this money to, and how has it impacted your decision-making as president? There are real national security concerns with the $421 million in debt and loans that we now know the president holds, and I think he's going to have a lot more questions. But again, that's one of those issues that I think a lot of people in D.C. really care about, because people here understand those implications. I just don't know how much that matters to a lot of voters.
I think you make a really good point, JD, because it's, do people even believe the reporting, right? Even the Bob Woodward book, one of the most respected journalists of our time, I think a lot of people just dismiss it as more of the same. On the issue of the debate, what a disaster. I mean, I had a hard time getting through it, and I'm kind of paid to get through it. And I basically was like, I can't watch this anymore. It was like torturous. One thing that struck out at me, because there was so much, right? Like there was just so much in there that we could do a whole podcast on just the debate. When Joe Biden distanced himself from Bernie Sanders and the progressive part of the Democratic Party, I wonder if that is going to do more damage to him than we are giving it credit for. I mean, we're so focused on Trump not condemning white supremacists, which, I mean, I don't know what else. Like, okay, that was just egregious. But do you think that the progressives are going to come out for Joe Biden?
I mean, listen, I speak with Justice Democratic members of Congress. There are 7 of them right now in the House, and includes the so-called squad, the Ro Khannas of the world, Pramila Jayapals. I talked to their congressional staffs very closely. They are focused as individuals to do whatever they need to do to make sure that Donald Trump does not win another term in the White House, for whatever that's worth. Now, you can look back and do a sort of a post-examination on, how vigorously did Senator Sanders really campaign passionately for Secretary Clinton back in 2016, and there have been statistics to say that almost 10% of Bernie Sanders' primary voters then broke and voted for President Trump in the 2016 general election. So I think that's a very real concern here. My sense from covering the Justice Democrat lane as close I have is that progressive voters do understand the stakes. But I do think about people like Kyle Kulinski and these are sort of like progressive thought leaders who have really big followings online, and they oftentimes shape the conversation. And because Medicare for All and the Green New Deal are sort of those backstop issues that are so important, they are very loud, and there is a loud contingency, Jill. I think you're right to say, hey, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden because his version of healthcare, his vision for these issues that matter so much to what we view to be progressive politics simply does not match up. And so I think the challenge is really on for people like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez to assuage those concerns of those more liberal progressive voters and say, hey, we can hash out our differences once we win, but we need to win first. I wouldn't be surprised if we do have some percentage of voters who just choose to sit home and not vote, largely off of those two issues.
The reason I'm sorry, Carlo, I know you want to jump in. The reason I wanted to just bring that up quickly is because we are so focused, and we started this podcast talking about the pivot counties, right? And we're so focused on this small number of swing voters, but might this thing actually hinge on the hardcore contingents of the parties and whether or not they show up?
And if they do, if the election gets litigated based on that, I would argue it's far more in the Republicans' favor, because look at the big fight in Washington right now, and it is what unites all conservatives. It's the judiciary. It is the Supreme Court. Anyone with an R next to his or her name can set aside his or her differences with Donald Trump and say, well, at least we've got federal judges, at least we've got the district and the Court of Appeals, and we've got the Supreme Court. We will back him for that. Joe Biden does not have that gravitas, I would argue, especially being a career politician over many decades with progressives. You disagree?
Well, I believe, I think, and again, this is sort of anecdotal and based on, my own experience and where I grew up and where I live, but I think that progressives are extremely ready to roll. I think that the left really wants Donald Trump to lose, and I think that the Supreme Court battle has a serious threat to the Republicans of really activating the base. So I don't know, but I did want to mention one thing, guys, about the debate, because sometimes I feel like we do a disservice in the media when we talk about how the debate was a mess, right? Obviously it was, right? But let's just be honest with ourselves, right? You may not like Joe Biden, you may not like what he said the other night, but he was adhering to the general idea of a presidential debate, right? The reason the debate was not just bad, but as Jill said, actually incomprehensible, was the president. I mean, he was, he made a strategic decision to appeal to his base, sort of shout everybody down, and generally kind of be a bully up there. And again, I think that the strategic decision was he was trying to show strength, and that works for his base. But he needs more than those voters, right? He needs people who aren't completely steeped in the sort of Fox News cinematic universe to come out and pull the lever for him, and I don't think he did that at all.
First of all, Fox News cinematic universe does not sound nearly as fun as the Marvel cinematic universe, but I appreciate the way that you frame that. I don't know if I would watch 24 movies much like Marvel has on the Fox News cinematic universe. But you're right. Look, Politico Morning Consult polling the other day said that there's about 14% of likely American voters who are still considered persuadable. That's going to determine the election. I mean, the margin of error, or the margin of difference, I should say, between Clinton and Trump in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania was 77,000 votes between those three states, and it's the reason that it's a Trump White House instead of a Clinton White House, and the margins could absolutely be that tight, if not tighter, by the time they count the votes. And so your point about the debate, I mean, of course, you're exactly right. It's just also interesting now, right? The Commission on Presidential Debates now needs to quite literally change the rules, because a 74-year-old grown man cannot sit there and adhere to the basic decorum of what a presidential debate should be. But that's the reality we find ourselves in heading into the last two Biden-Trump contests.
JD, we did get a question from one of our listeners that I can't answer, and I don't think Carlo can, so we're asking you. During the debate, it was stated that President Obama left 128 judicial seats open. How is that possible? What exactly does that mean? Walk us through it. Is that true?
Yeah, this is a great question. It is true, but it is very misleading. And I went back over the debate to watch that moment, and it came during one of President Trump's 2 minutes. So he really got to drive home this message, and Vice President Biden really couldn't pop in. But the reality is not that the Obama White House didn't try and get these positions filled. You got to keep in mind what the Senate component looked like, right? Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution basically says the president nominates them and the Senate passes them. And that's the Merrick Garland fight. Well, Barack Obama had the difficult task of having Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on the other side of Capitol Hill, or on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. And McConnell refused, much like he did more notably with Merrick Garland, to take these nominations up. So we talk about the fight for Merrick Garland. President Obama puts up the nominee. He never got a hearing. He never got consideration. Multiply that over 100 over the Court of Appeals and the district levels, and yes, you now have about 100 vacancies or so that President Trump basically walked into. Trump can easily fill them because McConnell's going to do basically whatever he wants here. The spin comes from President Trump when he makes this an issue of complacency. He says, well, Obama, Biden, didn't care.
Right.
Maybe they got complacent. Maybe they got lazy. That's not the truth. And this speaks to Senator Reid's use of the so-called nuclear option and these big procedural changes. And it largely becomes Republicans were not willing to play ball with President Obama, and that's why we did have the vacancies. So it is true, but it requires a lot more context than you're ever going to hear from President Trump.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Speaking of the court, though, JD, you recently tweeted that Democratic insiders were telling you that they don't really understand why Democrats in the Senate aren't putting up more of a fight when it comes to the Supreme Court. So I, first of all, love this type of stuff. Like, this is the type of stuff that if we were getting a drink in real life, I would be like, tell me everything that you hear behind the scenes that you can't tell us on camera. So my question to you is, tell us everything. Like, tell us everything that you can actually tell us that's like kosher for you to tell us, that you're kind of hearing behind the scenes from let's start with Democratic strategists. Are they nervous here? Are they nervous about, you mentioned in this tweet, they now feel like they could lose in November. I mean, is that the sentiment behind the scenes?
There's so much concern for Democratic sources, staffers, strategists, that we are somehow going to have a repeat of 2016 because no one saw it coming. It's been described, imagine you were preparing for a wedding and it turned into a funeral. And that's how Democrats still view the 2016 election. And I think their concern is to say, man, when it comes to the courts, no one fights dirtier than Republicans at the national level. If not dirty, they are at least willing to go places and say things and dig up controversies and be so aggressively relentless with their messaging.
Thank you. No. I don't mean to get worked up, but JD, you're right. The Republicans, this is what they do, right? This is what Mitch McConnell does. And while Democrats like to, they do a lot of virtue signaling, and they're all over the place. But Republicans get judges on the court.
But JD, okay, besides for Carlo, who I think just like his face turns the color of my shirt right now, which is red. Besides for that, is there anything for Democrats to actually do when it comes to the court? Why aren't they putting up more of a fight? And is that kind of like the sentiment that you're hearing from people that you talk to?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of frustration. The fact is, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, it's been described, has held these seats hostages. And they are willing to say and do absolutely anything, including not give Merrick Garland even any consideration for 269 days before the election. While there's nothing really outside of a few little wonky procedural things Democrats can do to sort of delay the proceedings here, there is this sense to say, man, Democrats really need fiercer fighters at the national level, and they need someone who can kind of push back against the messaging. Democrats are so positive frequently that they are on the right side of history. And this is what staffers tell me with most frustration. They say, first of all, if you're a congressional staffer, you defend your boss fiercely. And that usually includes off-the-record conversations. But there's a lot of frustration to say, our bosses are so confident on Capitol Hill that they're on the right side of history. And the facts are going to dictate that they were true. And Donald Trump simply deserves to be impeached, and everyone will see his impeachable behavior. But facts sometimes, unfortunately, in today's cycle are not going to persuade voters the way that hearing misinformation but hearing it loudly is going to do. And that's frequently what you get from the other side. And so while, no, I don't think there's much Senate Democrats can do outside of kind of gumming up, maybe sticking, a few procedural wonks to kind of delay it, there is a sense to say Democrats need to be fiercer with the idea of something like court packing, eliminating the filibuster, really going and approaching this in the spirit of warfare, because the frustration from a lot of people I talk to in Washington is Democrats are very good at losing elections. And this is an election that Democrats tell me they should not be losing. And yet these are pretty razor-thin margins in a lot of key states right now between both sides. And I do think, however, the top of the ticket goes, so too will go the Senate. So if it's a big night, if it's a big month for Joe Biden, you can expect Democrats in the Senate to pick up 3 to 4 necessary seats. And I do think that'll hold for President Trump as well.
Carlo, did you want to jump in there with anything on the courts?
I just think JD made a really good point that you don't really hear in the media a lot, which is that, this idea that I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. JD, what was the good point that you just made?
JD, welcome to the Need to Know podcast.
God.
So good to be here. Good to be back
sorry.
here, I should say.
All right, I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so that was what Democrats are telling you behind the scenes. What are Republicans telling you behind the scenes? Clearly, you see, I like the dirt. Like I am like the gossip that I'm like, tell me everything. What are, when you talk to Republican strategists?
There is no bigger gossip. There's no bigger place for gossip, place than Capitol Hill, right?
But what are Republicans telling you?
Yeah, you're exactly right. The scuttlebutt is always what is, I think, the most interesting part. There's also a lot of nervousness from GOP sources. There just absolutely is. I think congressional staffers I've spoken with, especially for the Senate Republicans, you could always tell sort of how antsy or nervous some sources are if they don't answer you. And that even comes like people who I know very well, who are frequently very communicative over text message. If there's a story that they know their backs are to the wall against, and it usually has to go with trying to answer for something the president tweeted or something the president said or something the president did that puts the rest of the Republican Party into a pinch, suddenly your sources, it's as if their phones are turned off and they're not really going to answer you. There's a lot of nervousness because there's so much uncertainty, and I think the character of Donald Trump and the sort of decency, empathy argument that Joe Biden makes, Republicans know that that is a vulnerability. And so I don't really remember elections where there's a lot of nervousness and anxiety on both sides, but that's very much my sense here heading into 2020. Democratic sources and staffers want to avoid what went wrong for them a few years ago. And I think Republicans say, hey, our margins were tiny. President Trump lost the popular vote by like 3 million votes. If you just kind of move the pieces on the chessboard slightly, and you have a virtually same election as 2016, Trump loses the Electoral College easily. And I think there's a lot of eggshell walking on both sides of this equation.
We have to wrap up shortly, but I just want to end with Election Day and kind of this, the peaceful transition of power, which is something that I think we've all taken for granted, that's just part of our process here. And now even Lindsey Graham, Mike Pence saying that they think this election is going to end up at the Supreme Court. Let's talk about this so-called nightmare scenario where the vote is close on election night. It might come down to absentee ballots that may not be in for days. How do you think this is going to play out potentially, and why are people so worried?
I think a lot of Democrats are very concerned because even the younger congressional staffers who are in their 20s, they know about Bush v. Gore. Everyone knows what happens in Florida back in 2000. And they know that there's actually an advantage to having elected officials in a state like Florida that are of the president's party. And not just then. Remember, Jeb Bush was a figure in all that, and he was then almost Governor Bush's brother in the state of Florida. And I think the concern is here, hey, if you get 9 people on the Supreme Court, what's to say you don't have another controversial statewide recount in Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and you kind of skew the pieces on the board in favor of the interests of the Republican Party. And that's sort of what a lot of people still say happened with the Bush v. Gore case, back in 2000. And so if this does get to be a bit of a toss-up into a judiciary, well, what's the one thing Mitch McConnell can hang his hat on in terms of his legacy? It's establishing a more conservative judiciary. Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell have almost been building up to this moment over the course of the last few years. If anything goes as high as the Supreme Court, well, the Supreme Court's job is going to be affirm or strike down something from a lower court. But the fundamental makeup of the lower courts is more conservative than it's been in quite some time. So I think that's a lot of the concern. This is going to be a really messy month. I don't see any way, Jill and Carlo, where we know the winner of very many of these races on election night. I really see we get far closer to Thanksgiving, in my opinion, before we really get a sense on those numbers for the White House and a lot of these Senate races. Yeah, I think this is going to be such a messy, weedy legal process, state by state. I know lawyers who have already been called up and are sort of being put on retainer in different places around the country to be on standby for what's going to be a really ugly, divisive few weeks, I think.
I'll say this, JD. I hope that whether Donald Trump wins or Joe Biden wins, I hope for the sake of this country and the democracy, that one of them wins huge on election night for this exact reason. But I just want to say one thing, because I think sometimes we may not really explain to people in the media like exactly what the issue is, right? So there's this issue, and JD, you tell me if I'm not sort of saying this correctly, but right in 2018 you had this sort of, I think they call it the blue shift, right? It looked during the midterm elections, it looked kind of close on election night. And then because there were so many mail-in ballots, and mail-in ballots break for Democrats by wide margins in a lot of places, you didn't get the sense that there was this really blue wave takeover of the House until the next day or a couple days later. So could you just talk very briefly about the concept of sort of a blue shift, a blue wave, the red mirage, and why it is that mail-in ballots are so problematic this year?
Yeah, I think the red mirage is something that's getting a lot of attention, and it basically speaks to this idea that if we were to take on face value the votes that have already come in on the night of Tuesday, November 3rd, on election night, well, the votes that are likely counted in electoral precincts are likely going to show stronger numbers for Republicans. That's just the demographics that will have had their votes counted by that point. And so the concern is saying, hey, how do you prevent @real Donald Trump from taking to Twitter and declaring sweeping national victory for the Republican Party when the votes are still being counted in their infancy? And that's really the pressure on tech and social media, which is really, I think, the most important component of maybe this entire election we haven't even touched on. And that's a very concerning, concerning nature. What you then have for probably the rest of November, or those few days or those few weeks after, are going to be those mail-in ballots, those votes that states and precincts continue to look at that may sort of start to level out the numbers. So what I do think is, I think newsrooms are going to be way more careful this time around than they've ever been. Don't look for the Fox Newses, for the Associated Presses, for the NPRs to be calling winners as early or as frequently as they have in past election cycles. I think there's got to be a higher level of responsibility for the media to make sure that the process is being conveyed, the context is being conveyed to American voters as well as possible, and to say, hey, let's take a beat. This is going to take a second to make sure that we are actually getting this information the right way. And we need to make sure that misinformation and disinformation is not spreading like wildfire and impacting what people think happened, because there's a lot of concern. I think that the information warfare surrounding this election is unfortunately going to be unlike anything we've ever seen.
JD, I have so many more questions, and I know Carlo does as well. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it there. But thank you.
We could do this every week. Maybe we should.
You know what? I kind of think, and I will say this as part of the mainstream media, I guess, I think we sometimes miss the point of some of these stories, and I think we just kind of like miss it. We missed it in 2016. But JD, you seem to really have your finger on the pulse of what Americans are actually thinking. So it's invaluable to have you on, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on, for joining us on this special podcast. And everyone, you could catch JD every day on Cheddar for the news wrap. It's at 4:30 Eastern time, 4:30 p.m. And you could follow him on Twitter at Durkin. And we will promise, of course, you have to come back, JD, if we're in a constitutional crisis at some point in the next few weeks. We will need you. We'll need you on the podcast.
Special. Yeah.
I hope on behalf of our democratic republic we are not in the midst of a constitutional crisis, but I don't think that's the smart money. I think it could be quite divisive, and I would love to come back anytime. Jill and Carlo, you do an incredible job with Need2Know. I'm so happy that I got to fill in and be here with you both today. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. That's what you need to know about election 2020.